Hello, everybody. Thank you for your interest in this BRAIN Initiative research resource grants for technology integration and dissemination. My name is Natalie Trzynski. I'm the program director for this program. I'm also joined today by my colleague, Jackie Durkin, who is a health program specialist and who works with me on this program, as well as for the BRAIN team dissemination. Next slide. So one of the first points I want to make for this entire webinar is just the fact that everything that I'm going to tell you today is in the text of the funding opportunity. But I'm going to be highlighting key points that I think are really important for you. But I do just want to emphasize that it's really in your best interest for this mechanism and honestly for every NIH funding opportunity that's out there for you to read the funding opportunity carefully and fully. Again, the purpose of this is just to clarify and kind of highlight some key points, and it's not intended to replace detailed information in the program announcement. Next slide. Okay, so what are the goals of this funding opportunity? So for those of you who are aware of the mission of the BRAIN Initiative, who are familiar with it, I don't think it'll come as any surprise that one of the key things coming out of the BRAIN Initiative has been really cutting edge technologies that can be used to study the brain, study its circuits, connect it to behavior. But the important thing is for those really cutting edge, amazing technologies to get out to the research community. And so this funding opportunity is thought to be kind of at the end of the development pipeline when this technology is well validated, well developed, and it's ready to go into more labs. And the hope would be is that it goes into a lot more labs and penetrates fully into the relevant research community, as opposed to maybe just going to a collaborator who's across the hall from somebody who made a really cool technology. So this is to provide support to broadly disseminate developed and validated tools and resources relevant to the goals of the BRAIN Initiative for integration into neuroscience research practice. And maybe you'll notice that I kind of emphasized a few words in that statement. And these are kind of key considerations for us making funding decisions and also for reviewers. And that's the idea of a broadly disseminable resource that's developed and validated, that's ready for dissemination, and that will, be able to get out to the community fairly quickly. In fact, actually, the pace of dissemination is a responsiveness criteria. I'll go into a little bit more what that means, but it's actually a requirement from the mechanism that broad dissemination is occurring by at least early in year 2 of the proposal. Obviously this has to be a resource that people want, that addresses a compelling need, and that there's basically no other ways that neuroscience researchers can easily get the same sort of tool through another forum, say if it's being sold or being disseminated in another way. You have to make the case that you're filling a gap here. Next slide. So besides obviously engaging in dissemination of your resource. There's some other activities that we see in a lot of these applications. These are by no means exhaustive. These are by no means saying that you have to include these other points. You have to include dissemination, obviously. You have to include distribution of your resource. But you may also want to think about user training as being a component to your project, to your aims. Accessing technology platforms, specialized facilities, core facilities. Minor improvements and minor adaptations are allowable, but again, I think it's important to note this is for well-validated, well-developed technologies. Um, if there's minor things that need to be done to make the technology really user-friendly, those are, kind of the scope that we're hoping that these proposals are limited to. I should say another important point here is that you don't need to have developed your resource using Brain Initiative funding, nor do you have to limit your dissemination to users that have Brain Initiative funding, um, nor do they have to be users that are within the United States. Um, you know, the biggest thing is that you are working in the space of the Brain Initiative, that your users are working in the space of the Brain Initiative, trying to, understand circuits, understand how the brain works, um, and yeah, your users can be working on specific disease areas, but but you shouldn't have a technology that's only applicable to one very specific disease area only. That's likely not going to be of interest to the Brain Initiative, which covers many different NIH institutes. Next slide. Okay, so with this being a U mechanism, a U24 mechanism, I'm just going to go into a little bit about what that means for the proposal, what that means for if you are ultimately awarded with this. And anytime that you see a U letter in an NIH mechanism, that tells you that it's what's called a cooperative agreement. And this just means that there are more interaction that you would have with NIH staff than for a typical R series grant. There's going to be NIH staff providing some level of oversight, coordination, facilitation. Another feature of this mechanism in particular is the fact that it is milestone driven. So there are yearly milestones associated with the award, and the milestones must be met in order to receive subsequent years of funding. So this is, again, not like a standard R01 in the fact that, once you get your award, as long as you're following policy laws, you're going to get subsequent years. You have to be demonstrating that you are meeting the goals of this program, that you are disseminating, and that you are meeting your milestones. So there's quantitative milestones associated with this mechanism, and milestone negotiation will occur prior to award. Next slide. So I kind of already touched on this a little bit, but I do want to go into what things are considered non-responsive to this mechanism. And I always say I really would hate to see somebody go through all the effort of putting together one of these applications and have it deemed non-responsive. And unfortunately, if something is deemed non-responsive, it is withdrawn prior to review. So as I mentioned, this is not for developing a novel or unproven technologies. It's not for developing a technology or software. You have to be disseminating by early year 2. And if it doesn't seem like that's the case, then again, unfortunately, the application would be withdrawn. Um, this does not support clinical trials or patient services. Um, you could have users perhaps that are using your technology for their own purposes that might include a clinical trial, but you yourself, as the contact PI, cannot be conducting a clinical trial for the purposes of this mechanism, nor is it for repositories of brain and biospecimens. I should also mention um, that if you are involved in disseminating or developing a data standard, that is also non-responsive to this funding opportunity. There is a separate team actually within the BRAIN initiative that focuses on data standards, on informatics in general. They have a suite of funding opportunities, and so I'm happy to get you in touch with that group if you are working in the data standards space. Um, I'd say again, one of the one of the key pieces of advice I can give you beyond reading the funding opportunity is to send your specific aims to ensure that they would be considered non-responsive, ideally at least 1 month prior to the due date, particularly if you want to set up a call and chat about your specific project and how to make sure that that you understand how it fits in with the program. Next slide. So in addition, there are some key components to this funding opportunity that you need to make sure you have in your application in order for it to be considered complete. Again, otherwise, unfortunately, an application would be withdrawn prior to review. And they're two attachments that I really want to highlight because they're really specific to this mechanism, specific to the brain initiative, and they are a proposed milestone and timeline, as well as the plan for enhancing diverse perspectives. So you need to make sure that you have these two attachments. The milestones is limited to 2 pages. The plan for enhancing diverse perspectives is limited to 1 page. And next slide. So for the milestones, again, no more than 2 pages in length, and they should provide a guide for what the yearly milestones will be for your project. Now, obviously, it being limited to 2 pages, you can't put absolutely every single tiny milestone that you think might be associated here, but just big picture, what are what are your goals for dissemination? How many users? How many unique institutions? These are kind of some of the high level things you should think about when putting together your milestone attachment. We really want to see these be quantitative and associated with desired outcomes as opposed to simply completing an activity. So, I have an example here of instead of putting something like, we're going to do a workshop in year 1, having something of, we're going to have a workshop, it's going to have so many users that attend it who represent so many unique institutions. So those are the kind of details that we would like to see in milestones. That should really be, they should really boil down to yes or no answers. Was this met or not? And there should also be a rationale for why, why certain values are chosen, why certain parameters are chosen within your success criteria. In the slides, there's a link here to a template that you may wish to consider again, you're limited to 2 pages, so you're going to want to pick and choose which of those you decide to put in your milestone attachment. Next slide. Okay, the next point is about the other really key attachment that you should have here, and which is part of pretty much all brain and initiative fundings now. And that is a plan for enhancing diverse perspectives. So this is a new approach that the Brain Initiative has taken in all our applications, to make sure that that people are, um, describing the diverse perspectives of the people who are involved in the research, the people who are participating in the research, and also where the research is done. So, this could include, the inclusion of investigators, trainees from a variety of backgrounds, including those who have been historically underrepresented in the biomedical research workforce, investigators from different scientific disciplines at varying career stages and with varying skills, experience, and expertise. Um, in terms of the where, this is about participation of researchers from all relevant sectors, including diverse organizations and institutions. Not just the research intensive institutions, but making sure that it's in institutions that have historically received less NIH funding, and are perhaps more involved in training, um, undergraduate, minority serving institutions, community based. Um, so we hope that that this will broaden the impact of the Brain Initiative by supporting projects, partnerships, and collaborations at institutions and organizations that to date have not been historically part of the Brain Initiative. And finally, who participates in the research? This is about making sure that there is equity in research participation. If you're having human studies as part of your as part of your application, that they represent the U.S. population, that they represent um, the population from which you're drawing from. So that's another expectation for this if you have human subjects as part of your research strategy. So it is a requirement that you submit a plan for enhancing diverse perspective attachment. And the idea is that this should be a one-page summary of how diverse perspectives are incorporated into the entire project. There should be sprinkled throughout the research strategy aspects of this, components of this, and the one-page attachment is really about the kind of culmination of everything, kind of putting it all together and just having an overview summary. Next slide. Right. So, as I mentioned, in the research strategy, you should have components of this, and then the one-page summary of that. This will be part of the scoring criteria, and will also be considered when funding decisions are ultimately made. They are it's part of significance, innovation, investigators, and approach environment. It's in all the review criteria where reviewers are asked to consider the PEDP as part of these criteria. Next slide. So again, the one-page summary should, like I said, be a summary of what's throughout the proposal. It should include timeline, milestones, benchmarks. It should have approaches for assessing progress. It's going to vary hugely depending on the specifics of your proposal. And so there's no, one way to do this. There's not a example. It's really about your project and thinking about what makes the most sense, and really what you think the project would benefit from. There also is, you can incorporate it into your budget as well. Next slide. So I do just want to highlight this idea of broad dissemination. Again, one of the key considerations with this mechanism is the idea of getting brain technologies to the wider research community. Again, not just, your buddy down the hallway. So we want to see that users span many unique labs, many unique institutions, that they represent the diverse perspectives that I just described. And, a component that I definitely tell potential applicants is to think about your letters of support as being a place where you can demonstrate that you've considered diverse perspectives, that those letters of support, aren't just all from your institution, that they represent a wide variety of types of users from different institutions across, that are also geographically diverse. And again, just want to emphasize the fact that you don't have to be limited to investigators that have their own brain initiative funding. I also want to point out another component of the research strategy in this mechanism, that we've fairly recently added, and that's a discussion of the technology evolution. So I realize that this might be kind of, looking into a crystal ball a bit, but you will want to describe how you believe that the technology will remain relevant and cutting edge and highly desired by the user community over the entire period of support, um, which can go up to 5 years. But again, you do not have to ask for 5 years. You can ask for less than that. And like, I think that to when you're thinking about this question of technology evolution, I think utilizing what has happened in the technology space historically, or fairly recently, how quickly has it been evolving over the past 5-10 years? If it's a space that's rapidly evolving, how do you address it? What if something came along? What if something came along that was much better in a year or two? Again, you can't see everything in the future, but kind of making the case of how quickly this has been evolving in the past can help you make the case for the amount of support that you're asking for. Next slide. I do just want to again highlight the letters of support. It is important to note that you are limited to 10 letters of support from potential end users. That 10 is only end users. So you can have more than 10 for other letters that maybe describe institutional support, third party interest, collaborative agreements. If you have a sub-award that's going to be helping on the research strategy, those don't count towards the 10. The 10 is just potential end users. I really encourage you to put in a cover letter where it will make it really clear to us which ones are potential end users and which ones are other letters of support. Next slide. Another key component to the newest iteration of this funding opportunity is the inclusion of a data management and sharing plan, which has been added to all NIH applications. So this is a other plan attachment where you should be describing, what data will be shared, what standards will be used for the data, archives, and timelines for submitting the data. Importantly, this refers to experimental data that is generated as part of the research strategy, not the experimental data that your users may be collecting that are using your resource. So, it's really about, say, if you are, you have to do a small experiment to validate that something is working well for the resource, say. That data is considered here. But, if you're, disseminating, say, a tool to a researcher, and then they're going off and using it to collect their own data, it's not referring to that data itself. You don't have to, um, make sure that your user shares their experimental data with you and that it's in a certain archive. Next slide. Okay, so renewal application. So if you have had a previous one of these awards and you're coming back for a renewal, that is permitted in this mechanism. A key thing, though, is to make the case why this mechanism in particular is needed to continue to disseminate the resource. Our strong hope is that these resources, as they get out there more, they will become self-sustaining. Either the research community sees how great they are and wants to pay fees for them, or users are incorporating you into their own NIH, your resource into their own NIH proposals, separate NIH proposals, um, that it's perhaps commercialized, that your, institution is now supporting your research. Those are all other ways that we hope that this can move off of this particular mechanism. But if it really, if none of those other ways can work, you have to make the justification for that, that you've looked into other ways to do this, but that really this is the mechanism that makes the most sense to continue to broadly disseminate the resource. So reviewers will be considering the progress that you've made, how well, how successful you've been in broad dissemination, that investigators from diverse perspectives have, been able to get this resource, and what things have worked and what things haven't, and how things will, how you will have learned from those previous experiences in dissemination for your renewal. So hopefully there is, evolution and improvements in your dissemination plan. And finally, again, sustainability should really be thought about for renewals. Hopefully other ways that can support dissemination of the resource. I would also encourage you to consider reporting on who your users have been in terms of what institutions they've come from, what career stages, et cetera. And there is more detail within the text of the funding opportunity that talks about, how you might think about categorizing that reporting strategy. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to end with a couple common questions that I tend to kind of see over and over when I talk to people. The first one is about cost structures, about user fees. Can I just give this away for free? Do I have to charge something? do I have to give it away for free? There isn't a specified way in which you have to go about user fees. Um, it is fine if you want to give it away for free, but you might want to consider user fees as a component to your sustainability plan. Perhaps changing it over the period of support that you've requested. And again, I just want to highlight the idea of sustainability. In particular for this mechanism is just this idea of how will this resource continue to be disseminated following ending of this NIH funding stream. Um, so some things to think about for a scientific steering committee or group. So the scientific steering group is, a unique component to this mechanism, where we require there to be a group of your peers that can come together to help advise you on the dissemination of your resource. Um, and these you have to be meeting with them at least twice a year, discussing how dissemination is going, discussing prioritization, sustainability plans, what have you. Importantly, when you're putting together your application, you should be thinking about what this group will do, what they will be advising you on, if they will be, involved in prioritization, to what level. You don't need to name specific members per se. In fact, we often discourage that because it leads to more, conflicts in putting together the review of your application. The key thing is that you have what are the types of expertise that will be on this panel. Somebody who has a background in X, somebody who has a background in Y. Like that is the type of thing you should be talking about for your scientific steering group. What is the allowed budget for this? So there's not a limit. There's not a specific number. You do not need to ask for permission if you are asking for over 500K direct costs. However, um, it needs to reflect the actual needs of the proposed project, and it needs to be very well justified. We have anticipated, something like $10 million per year for this program, for 10 to 20 awards. So, kind of based on that, you can get a sense of what we're expecting the budgets to be under. But again, there's not a particular number by which, it won't be considered, um, if it's above, a certain amount. But again, um, it should be well justified. Next slide. You can see what is currently funded by this mechanism if you go to the link on the slides, and you'll see a table for what is currently funded here. And finally, I often get the question, my resource is very specific to a very particular niche of researchers. Is that going to be okay? That is fine. I think that, when it comes to a resource that is really specific to, to a type of researcher, but for whom it would be transformative for that group, I think you can definitely make the case that, this niche of users would really, it would entirely transform the field if they had access to this. And importantly, you have to demonstrate that you're going to be distributing broadly to that group of researchers. We have more frequently asked questions as well on the website, so I definitely encourage you to check that out. Click on that link. Next slide. Okay, and I want to close with some other final resources for you to check out. All these, links are in the slides for you to click on. We have a program page on this, which includes frequently asked questions, a milestone template, as well as the projects. We have a larger Brain Initiative Dissemination Program page, that top link. That talks about all the different things that we're doing in dissemination beyond this particular program. Definitely encourage you to check that out. And there is a wealth of guidance around the PEDP that I would definitely also encourage you to check out if you have any questions on that. And with that, last slide. Yeah, definitely reach out to myself and or Jackie if you have any questions. The next due date is February 14th. Um, so if you are interested, I definitely encourage you to contact us at least 1 month prior to the due date and send us a draft specific games page, as well as ideally also a letter of intent. That's really helpful to us as well. And with that, thank you all so much for listening to this webinar. And yeah, get in touch.